Hi, this is Dan Korver, pastor here at Dalton Hill Baptist Church. We're a small Baptist church located in Owasso, Oklahoma. We're small enough to know you, but we're big enough to serve you and for you to serve as well. Our vision is to rescue, restore, and return to service. Rescue a non-believer or a believer who has been hurt or is lost, restoring them to Christ in fellowship with other believers with the desire that they in turn will help others along their way.
How many of us that believe in great is thy faithfulness, and all that I need, he provides each and every day. So often we get caught up in worrying about tomorrow, and tomorrow the worries never show up. Wednesday night we'll be finishing up on the series we've been doing on worry, and I think it's kind of practical things we can do to help us. Today we're on the working on Paul. We've been doing this, we've got the 15th week, I believe. And having talked to several people in recent years about retirement, I've had a lot of different reviews. I've had one that says it's not all it's cracked up to be. There's been a number that have retired and decided it wasn't, and come back to work at the refinery in different capacities. I've had others say it's great, I wished I'd done it earlier. Some will say, finding the adjustment hard. I've heard that many times, especially the first 6 months. And I have others that have said that I have no purpose or meaning left in my life. Part of that because all their meaning was found where? In work. You think about it, so did Paul never retired, but he certainly had a lot of challenges and changes in his circumstances. And you think about it, I think it's important when you look at it from his conversion. If you remember in Acts 9 in verse 15, if you remember when he had his conversion, it says Paul is going to be, I'm commissioning him to be an instrument of God before the Gentiles, before kings, and before the Jews. So from the very beginning he had a commission. By the way, how many of us have a commission?
All of us.
2 Corinthians, if you remember, we are told that we are all ambassadors for Jesus Christ. So Paul, his commission is the same, but his circumstances are changing greatly. And so he'll have to think of different ways with which to do that. And so when you think about it, today, when you think about it, if you wanted a title, Confined but Still Carrying On. Any of you ever feel like you're being more and more confined? How many of you are finding your body doesn't allow you to do a lot of stuff? You're a lot more confined than you once were. I think most of us can relate to that. In Acts 28 is where we're going to be. Confined, it's still carrying on. The last part was that of contentment. We'll probably have to put it off till next week because I don't think we'll have time. If you remember, Paul has gotten to the island of Malta, shipwrecked, if you recall. It's interesting, the island of Malta, if you know much about history, how important was the island of Malta during this World War II? Very important. Why? Control shipping, and that's why England wanted to have it, and why Germany did not, because they wanted to go Germany wanted to go obviously from South Africa to Italy and go through there, and obviously England wanted it, and so much of it was battling over Malta, and miraculously God allowed us to spare Malta with the British being there. Really helped them out tremendously during the war. Malta's been around and been in history for some time. So you see, this is where they're at. If you'll notice, the first one I want you to think about, how long was, ask the question before I give you the point, how long was he supposed to be on this island? Just a temporary stopping point, right, on the way to going on to the next part? But what's Paul's commission? Is he not supposed to be an instrument to who? To everyone. So when you think about this, serving while you or others are in transit, when we're in transit, how many times do we think about serving? You stop at a restaurant. You're in an airport. Most of the time, we're going someplace, you're on a mission trip, and you're gonna serve when you get there. How many of us think about serving in between time? So let's look at that. Notice, I think it's interesting, Paul would have been probably in his late 60s by now, somewhere around there. Has his body been through any tough times? And has he just got through going through a shipwreck in the middle of the storm? So let's look at it. I think serving while you or others are in transit, doing your part physically. Notice in verse 1 to 3, they get to the island of Malta in verse 1, verse 2. The natives meaning non-speaking Jews, Greeks, showed up extreme kindness, for because of the rain that had set in, because of the cold, they kindled a fire and received us all. How wore out would you be? Wintertime, you're in a storm, you're soaking wet, and the wind's blowing. You know, do you think he might have had any arthritis? You think about it, and obviously they're showing them kindness. Notice what Paul does then. I think doing our part physically. If you were Paul, what would you do? Notice what he does. Paul gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire. How many of us would have said that's your job? So Paul goes out gathering sticks, obviously being shipwrecked. And it says they laid it on the fire. A viper came because of the heat. Obviously, being in the wintertime, it would be dormant. You get to the fire, it's going to wake up, it can move, and it fastens on his hand. Now, I've read on different ones. It's interesting. People say, and according to today, there is no deadly poisonous viper on the island of Malta. Well, there may not be today. That doesn't mean there wasn't one then. For instance, 100 years ago, was there any pythons in the Everglades?
No.
No. Are there pythons today in the Everglades?
Yes.
They're everywhere. So obviously having grain ships, having all these ships coming, in fact the Maltese people today said, well, they were poisonous snakes, but when Paul does this miraculous thing, they became non-poisonous. They've been non-poisonous ever since. I'm not going there, but it says that obviously you see this, and it was a snake that they were familiar with, and it would be a deadly. For instance, the king cobra. If you get bit by a king cobra, how much time do you have? 10 minutes. A co-worker that I worked with was bitten by just a coral snake in Alabama, and he died before they could get him out. They were hiking before he could get to the hospital. Again, they are poisonous snakes. So notice what happens then. He does his part, he's picking this up. Second part, he doesn't worry about what others think. Notice in verse 4 to 6, the natives saw the creature hanging from his hand and began saying to one another, undoubtedly this man is a murderer, and though he has been saved from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live. He shook off the creature into the fire and suffered no harm. What would normally happen, it would affect your nervous system and your heart, and you would swell up and you would die. So when they're looking at him, what do they expect? Obviously, how do they know he's a prisoner? So obviously there's, based on dress or different things, they knew he was a prisoner, and they think, oh, he's going to die. How often do we do the same type of thing today? Judgment that we have, and notice then what happens. No harm. So now their opinion changes. One minute he's a murderer, next thing they think what? He must be a god. Well, their opinion changes really quick. I mean, one time you're over here, and something happens, and now you're over here. Now, obviously, again, remember, by the way, how many of them would have seen this? Would everybody that was on the ship also see it? So you think about it, everything that Paul said on this journey on the ship is taking place. And he's telling them about their true God, and all of a sudden God miraculously saves him. How much more do you think the people on the ship are going to listen to his message? How much more are these people going to listen? So why does God cause you to go through different things? Because he wants us to be the witness for him. So you think about it, when you think about it, how often do I judge based on circumstances? Any of you made judgments based on circumstances? Falsely did. Am I willing to do my part even picking up sticks? How many of us will, that's not my job? How many times do you ever, and how many times do you hear that? I mean, it's amazing. I had people that had me open gates. They had a key, but they wouldn't open the gate. So they'd call me on the radio and I'd drive across the plant to open the gate. And then I'd get a call back on the radio, I'm finished with the gate, will you close it? No, they can't get out of the car and close the gate. So you drive across the, and their answer was, that's why I got the education, so I wouldn't have to do those kind of things. Okay. So if you want to pay me to drive across to open the gate or close it, okay. But again, how important is it for us to do our part? Notice the second thing, doing your part spiritually. He's doing it, he's arrived, and he does it. The neighborhood of that place where the land belonged to a leading man in the house, verse 7. And Publius, who welcomed us and entertained us courteously 3 days. It came about that while their father Publius was lying in bed afflicted with recurring fever and dysentery. Okay, you're only going to be there for a short period of time. And you're moving on to Rome. Notice what does Paul do? Paul went in to see. Paul takes a personal interest in it. Why? How often do we take interest in people? Notice he prays for him, laid his hand on him and healed him. Notice what happens. And after that happened, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases were coming to him and getting cured. Earlier they thought what? I mean, he's a murderer. He does his part, picks up the sticks. He takes an interest. Well, let me go and see your father. Let me pray for him. God heals him. Now they're bringing all the different ones that are sick. I remember reading one commentary and it says, well, this is, Luke was doing it through his medicine. Well, first of all, notice it said they were bringing them to Paul. And if they threw everything overboard and grain and all the tackle and everything else, do you think that Luke was able to jump overboard and swim to shore carrying his doctor's bag? I mean, just sometimes you read some of this stuff and you think, man, this stuff's really getting far out when you start reading some of it. And God miraculously healed him. But again, why? Paul got involved. He got involved physically. He got involved spiritually. Didn't know how long he'd be there, but he'll be there through the winter. But again, it's interesting. Notice the results that you have. In verse 9, he passes it on. But notice in verse 10, their provisions. They also honor us with many marks. Us would be Luke and as well as Aristarchus, with marks of respect. And when we were setting sail, they supplied us with all we needed. How important? What happened to all their supplies? By the way, Paul didn't charge them anything for their services. But out of gratitude, they supplied the entire ship with what they needed. How many times do you and I get involved with people? Hey, we're in transit. What happens when you see somebody and a waitress or whatever, and she's having a difficult time? Do you say, can I pray for you? Give her a better tip? Whatever it might be. You stop and you think about it. It's interesting. It's getting involved. So think about it. The first one, when you look at it, if we're only on a layover on a trip, do I take interest or get involved with what's going on around me? Remember, Paul's calling was to do what? To be God's witness. And everywhere he's at. By the way, he's now a prisoner, but he's still a witness. And so you think about it, doing the part, and you notice also then starting in verse 11, you have others doing their part. So Paul's doing his. Notice the other. In the perspective, you ever wonder why verse 11 is in this verse? At the end of 3 months, so this would have been the end of February, so November, December, January, normally when they wouldn't travel, which Paul told them don't leave in October because it's getting too late in the season. It's now time when the winds change and it'd be a good time to sail. They set sail on an Alexandrian ship, which had wintered there. Again, another grain ship, which had the twin brothers for its figurehead. why would he mention twin brothers, and what does that mean? Twin brothers, Zeus, according to the Greek mythology and stuff, Zeus had relations and had twins, and they're twin brothers, and they were put on the, carved out and put on the front of the ship, and that was supposed to protect them in storms. Who had a better protection and who did better? Paul and his God protecting him, or these twin brothers? And I think it's interesting because obviously the last Alexandrian ship didn't do too well, did it? And so I think it's important for us to look at it, why these little things are there. And so all of it, he is speaking to the sailors, he's speaking to the people on the island, he's speaking to everyone. Notice the path, they then go in the first 12 and 13, it basically tells you how they get there, and they come at the end of verse 13. Rome, the port of Rome at that time was not deep enough. And so they had to, the port that was deep enough that could handle the grain ships, and then they'd have to be taken by land to get to Rome. And so this is where they put in. And so that's the path. Notice the partners in verse 14. There we found some brethren and were invited to stay with him 7 days, and thus we came to Rome. How'd you like to invite Paul? Do you think you know anything about Paul? Why would they know about Paul? How many of you have ever heard of the book of Romans? Paul had already written it. He had never been there, and you remember his original plan was to go to Spain and just stop off there. Well, he's going to Rome, but not the way he originally wanted. But interesting, he stays there 7 days. They invited him. I think it's interesting too. They had to look for the believers, and then they're welcomed by the believers. And notice what happens then. They stayed there 7 days. So 7 days from now will be what day? Today is the 10th. Next Sunday will be the 17th, St. Patty's Day. Think about this. Brethren, they heard about us, came as far as the market at Appleton. Where is that at? And how far is that? It's 43 miles. That's from here to Leonard, here to Kiefer. You're there 7 days. Word gets out. And how did people get there? Walk. Why would they come all the way far to see Paul? Has Paul helped them with the book of Romans? Has Paul helped others that may have helped him along the way? How many of us would have said, well, that's just a waste of time, I won't be there when I get there, or whatever it might be. So they get there, and notice what happens in the end of verse 15. And when Paul saw them, he what? Thanked God and was encouraged. Why would he be so thanking God? When you start seeing people traveling that far just to see you, in what kind of condition, you're in chains, you're in all this other stuff, is that going to encourage you to continue your ministry and continue on? Just people coming and encourage you. How important is it? And so I think it's interesting. Paul does his part. He does it physically. Paul does his part spiritually, presenting, whether it be through prayer or through teaching. They do their part by coming and encouraging or allowing them to stay with him. If he is the most noted believer and he's a prisoner, how many of us want to associate because we may be found guilty along with him? So think about it. Would you have welcomed him? How would you like to travel with Paul? I'll catch a later flight. Right? Wherever he goes, he's getting in trouble, isn't he? I mean, it's been that way in every single city. Aristarchus has already been through that twice. And I think it's interesting his answer. Notice then, I think the second thing, besides just serving while you're in transit, how about serving those where you are temporarily placed? Serving those where you are temporarily placed. In verse 16, and when they entered Rome, Paul was allowed to stay by himself with a soldier who was guarding him. And if you notice in verse 30, he stayed 2 full years in his own rented quarters. So he's there for 2 years. But anywhere he wants to do anything, he has who with him?
Soldier.
A soldier. You need to go to the bathroom, who's going with you? Soldier needs to go to the bathroom, who's going with the soldier? You think about it, anywhere you're going, you have them with you. Now what kind of, how would you be feeling about right now when this is happening? You remember your ministry is to speak of Jesus Christ to everyone. If you remember, Paul had originally said he's going everywhere that he knows where the gospel hasn't gone. That's why when he writes Romans, I wanted to go to Spain. But now that things have changed, Paul can't just go where he wants to go. How many of us are getting more and more restricted in what we can and cannot do? So notice, I think it's interesting on his companions. Who's with him? Luke and Aristarchus. Let's look at it in these companions. His calling, notice in verse 17, and it happened that after 3 days, he called together those who were the leading men of the Jews. How could he call together the leading Jews? Where is he? He's confined. How can he get the Jews there? How can the word get out to the Jews? How large a city is Rome at this time? Take a guess. It's the largest Gentile city in the world at that time. You're over 1 million people. You think about it. So Paul wants to speak to them, but he can't go to them like he did in the past. But who's with him? Aristarchus. If you look at Colossians and you look at Philemon, Aristarchus is called a fellow prisoner. How is he a fellow prisoner? He's staying with him at Rome. He's called a fellow worker in Philemon. Aristarchus and others are then going to the Jews or other people and say, Paul wants to talk to you. Is Paul still having a ministry? Is he still doing it? Is he still trying to reach people? It's in a different way. But he's still doing it. So they come, and it's interesting, they then come, and notice he then in verse 17, you'll notice down through 22, he tells them why he's in prison. Basically he's saying, I'm in prison because fellow Jews put me here. They falsely accused me and were wanting to put me to death. You find it in 19, and I had basically no thing to do except to appeal to Caesar, and that's why I'm here. They said they haven't heard anything, but we notice in 22, it's interesting. We desire to hear from you what your views are, for concerning this sect, talking about Christianity, they thought it was part of Judaism at the time. It is known to us and spoken bad everywhere. We want to hear about it. Paul goes, people goes, brings them to him, they all come. So now you have you want to speak to them. Again, how do you want to stir up another group? But that's his calling. In 23, you'll notice what happens then. They come, and he starts to reason with them in 23. When they set a day for him, they came to him, his lodging, in large numbers. How'd you like to be? By the way, many of the Praetorian Guard came to know Christ because of what's said. We find that later in the epistles. And he starts to talk to them. So a huge number of Jews come on a set day. And Paul, notice what he does. He starts to testify of the kingdom of God, trying to persuade them concerning Jesus. He's the promised Messiah, death, burial, and resurrection, from both the law of Moses and from prophets, from morning until evening. How'd you like to have a huge group? And notice his text. Scripture. They're coming to him. By the way, isn't that his calling? I can't go to you, so I'm inviting you to come to me. And I can't even get the message to you. I have others bringing them to you, going to you. So notice then it's interesting what happens in 24. You have the response. First part, some were being persuaded, but others were not. Whose job is it? My job is simply, and yours is simply to give out the truth of Jesus Christ. Some will believe and some will not. That's not up to us. It doesn't mean you're successful or non-successful. You simply give out the truth. Paul couldn't go to them. He invites them. Now, how many of you want to stir up more people in this next city you're at? You remember you're going to Rome to go before Caesar, and how many of you want to have a local group get upset with you? But that doesn't stop Paul from speaking the truth. And notice when they didn't agree, verse 25, with one another, Paul then uses this words, quoting from the book of Isaiah, verse 26. Go to the people and say, you will keep on hearing, but will not understand. You'll keep on seeing, but will not perceive. For the heart of this people has become dull, and their eyes they scarcely hear, and they have closed their eyes, lest they should see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their hearts, and return, and I shall heal them. That's a good way to influence people, isn't it? But notice he's speaking the truth from Isaiah, and most will not believe, but some will. But whether one believe or none, Paul's still going to be. So he serves physically. He serves spiritually. You notice he's also serving even if he's temporarily placed here. The reason he's here 2 years is they had 2 years with which to bring the accusations from Jerusalem to him, to the Nero. After 2 years, they never came. Therefore, Paul was set free. That's when he writes 1 Timothy and he writes Titus. How would you like to sit there for 2 years? By the way, how long was he in prison in Caesarea? 2 years. How long was the trip in between? How'd you like to have 4.5 years of your time basically falsely accused and basically being a prisoner when you shouldn't have been at all? But did Paul use this time? Did he speak to Agrippa? Did he speak to Festus? Did he speak to Felix? Does he speak to the people on the island? Does he speak to the Jews in Rome? He's speaking to all of them in a different form, a different way. I can't go to them, they can come to me. It's interesting in 28, notice what he says then. Let it be known to you, therefore, that the salvation of God is to be sent to the Gentiles, and they will listen. And they did. And Paul went to the apostle to the Gentiles. You stop and you think about it. Notice that interesting what he does. What about his attitude? So you see his calling. But notice what he has in 30 and 31. He stayed 2 full years in his own rented quarters and was welcoming all who had come to him, preaching the kingdom of God, teaching concerning the Lord Jesus with all openness and unhidden. I can't go to you, but you what? You come to me and I'll teach and preach and do all this. By the way, he wrote 4 letters in these 2 years too. What 4 letters did he write? Ephesians? Colossians? Philemon. Prison epistles. He wrote the prison epistles. You stop and you think about it. He may have been limited in where he could go, but he still carried out his calling by preaching to all those who would come. He also is using his pen to write to those that he cannot go to. He couldn't make another missionary journey to help them, so he uses his pen. How many of us are thinking of different ways that we can? My circumstances may change, but has my calling changed? My calling hasn't changed. Do I find ways to use my calling? You know, that's the reason why Fanny Crosby says what? I'm thankful that God caused me to go blind at 6 weeks, because basically it really kept her incredibly focused in writing this. Did you ever look to see what they got paid for writing those songs? It was just a few dollars. If you're trying to make a living and you only get a few dollars for writing a song, up to $5, how many of you can imagine why you're writing 6,000 songs? I mean, it's amazing what they got. How would you describe his countenance? He was welcoming them all up. Philippians 4 says what? I've learned to be content. How many of you would be content being chained falsely and not allowed to do what you want to do and go where you want to go? And yet you are content in serving. So think about it. How many of us are carrying basically serving physically? How many of us are serving spiritually? whether it's in transit or at a temporary location. We're going to still stay true to our calling and serve. So we want to be like Paul. That's what it takes.
We'd love for you to come and visit with us and fellowship with us. We're located at 8263 North Owasso Expressway, which is on the east side of Highway 169 North, between 76th and 86th Street North. We have coffee and fellowship from 8:30 to 9 Sundays, followed by Sunday school for all ages from 9 to 9:45, and our Sunday morning worship service is from 10 to 11. We likewise have a Wednesday night service for all ages from 7 to 8. Now may the Lord of peace himself give you peace at all times, and in every way the Lord be with you all the time.